Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shown. I'm joined by Sam Spieler and Eyad Daris.
Hey.
Hey.
Hello, hello, hello. Today we are finishing up our discussion on Kirinyaga by Mike Resnick. This is the second book in our Contemporary Utopias series. If you're joining us for the first time, we are also a literary book club on Reddit. That discussion is in the episode description. If you'd like to support us, you can click on our bookshop.org link in the episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will move on to the last book in our Contemporary Utopia series with a review of The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well.
So when James suggested this book and I took a look at a picture of Mike Resnick, the first thing that hit me is, man, this guy is white, and this is a book about Africa. And I think most people nowadays, non-boomers, would probably have some kind of feeling about that, like, did not seem cool, But I couldn't really express what problem I had with it. I was just like, oh, that does not seem like a good look. And I think Resnick kind of knew it might not be a good look. And I think in this collection, he tries to avoid making any sort of conclusive statement about the post-colonial African politics that he's writing about. I think he thought that would probably be a step too far for him as an outsider. But do you think he actually was successful in avoiding that? And does the novel, are we going to call it a novel or a collection of stories or whatever, does it have anything to say about Africans and their adoption or their choice not to adopt European culture?
I think it's generous to say that he was conscious of that. I'm not sure he was.
Well, would you say that it's fair that he could have said more? He could have been more authoritative in saying, well, Africans should do this and they shouldn't do that.
Sure. I guess he definitely seems like he was conscious enough not to go too far. To answer your actual question, I don't know, because on one hand, we have Kariba, who is trying to say something about post-colonial African politics. But as we've already discussed, he's not the best poster child for that. And he's not a successful poster child. But then on the other hand, we have the Kenyans, who we don't see very much of. I'm thinking mostly of the prologue and the epilogue.
Do you think that the Kenyans are better off than they are on Kirinyaga? Because that would point to whether or not Africans would be better off with European culture or not, wouldn't it?
I don't think he answers conclusively one way or the other. They live different lives. They live easier lives in that it seems like they have easy access to things like healthcare and modern machines and such. But if we look through Kariba's eyes, we also see a lot of hollow old men who have nothing to do with their time.
So the epilogue is where we get most of what the book shows us in terms of this post-colonial African politics, or his commentary on the intersection of African culture and European culture. There's that one part of the epilogue where he finds his son is learning French to talk to a diplomat. I mean, it's quite obvious in that section. And I think it really is just present in the epilogue, and maybe in that one story with the nurse who comes to treat the pilot who's crash landed on their planet. But really, it's the epilogue that kind of addresses these issues. If you remove the epilogue, I think the book assiduously tried not to make any kind of comment. And it could just be a very generic book about any kind of colonized people and the colonizers that they are escaping from.
Despite my initial concern, I think Resnick was actually quite successful at avoiding a overtly negative depiction of Africans, regardless of Kirinyaga or Kenya. I think he's mostly successful because he doesn't show bias against African characters. He allows them to have a range of subjectivities. They don't speak as one voice, they have different opinions, and they have different ways of understanding the world around them. So they are more or less real people. They are not fleshed out round characters, but they have distinct minds, which is more than you can say for some other writers. He also, I think, is keen to point out some of the negative aspects of European culture. When they return to Kenya, they do talk about how some animals are extinct, and his friend, when they return to Kenya, talks about something like Kenya is corrupt and chaotic. There are problems with European culture and European styled societies. There is, though, some negativity not towards African people, but towards traditional African cultural practices, specifically the Kikuyu cultural practices, which I think are more often than not painted in an exclusively negative light. They are seen as the thing that Kikuyu people must be saved from, rather than something that they might choose to cherish. And that, to me, I think, is where he expresses his strongest point.
Where do you see this, Eyad?
Well, everything in the novel that they do as Kikuyu people is negative, from the baby being born in breach and then being killed, to not allowing women to learn how to read or learn how to progress and, weave better fabrics or cook better food or whatever it is. There are just lots of examples where he guides his society towards something that I think the novel instructs us to be seen as a negative outcome.
They don't even use, for the most part, simple machines. And when I say simple machines, I mean the 6 or 7 basic things like, the wheel that we base all our other machines on.
I'm not sure because I agree that by the end of the story cycle, this novel and stories, you definitely get the sense that this is what the people want. They want to move on, maybe not from like female circumcision or even killing their children in breach, but they want technology. They want an easier life and medical treatment. But at the beginning, I feel like the tone is fairly neutral. It's not really weighing in on whether or not that child should be killed or not if the child is born feet first in breach. I feel like the tone is actually pretty neutral, and instead he relies on the reader's own biases. He doesn't dissuade you from thinking the child should not be killed or should be killed, but he's, I think, assuming that you will hold the opinion that the child should not be killed. But I don't think he's like belaboring it or anything. It's as neutral as possible.
I think that the individual presentations are not necessarily as problematic as it might seem, but rather it's his choice to collect them in one place and to present them in sequence that makes it seem more negative. What I want to understand really, though, is why people are upset by white people, or more broadly, Western people, writing non white characters. There is a Black science fiction writer, Charles R. Saunders, who chided Resnick. He wrote an article, Why Blacks Should Read and Write Science Fiction. He criticized Resnick for what he saw as an overemphasis on the negative aspects of African societies and their cultural practices. At the end of that article, Saunders concludes with a call to arms, and he says that if we don't unleash our imaginations and tell our own science fiction and fantasy stories, people like Mike Resnick will tell them for us. So I think that's similar to what I've been talking about, this kind of exclusive negativity. But when people are concerned with representation and they're concerned with outsiders talking about other groups of people, is the emphasis on the negative aspects of that group the most important concern?
It's kind of like bashing your home team, right? When James talks about how the Giants really suck, that's a bad example, actually.
They're awesome. They are an awesome team and they don't suck. That's why it's a bad example. And you shut your dirty mouth, A's lover.
James, you're one to readily offer about how the Warriors aren't good or whatever. But we had this discussion before about how anyone coming into a discussion and saying, well, no, here's where they're a problem, you're going to get a lot of people jumping down your throat, even if it's coming from inside the house. If you get people coming from the outside, that's even worse. To get back to this, I think it is a major concern. I don't think it's the only major concern. I think the assumption that someone from the outside understands, good or bad, all of a person's plights in a culture that is not their own is the problem. In trying to answer this, I found someone talking about this book where they said that Resnick dives into Africa's own attitudes about their own worlds and traditions. And I thought that was a funny way to put it, considering it's an assumption. It might be true, but one, not only is it an assumption, it might not be the full truth. What I think Saunders is getting at is that it doesn't really matter how honest Resnick is with the story. Having someone else telling your story and putting words into your mouth and claiming that it's your story is the problem, regardless of whether it's highlighting the negative aspects or positive aspects.
So when we say it's a problem, what do we mean exactly? Like people shouldn't do it? Or people should be careful about it?
That I don't know.
You know, one of our shared experiences that we draw on, that I draw on anyway, when we have these discussions, is we all lived in China. And in China, you know, the people who live in China, the actual Chinese people, not me who was born in the US, they hate it when foreigners talk about China, especially negatively. But I think as someone who is not Chinese, you know, if you see something that you disagree with politically, you feel compelled to speak out against it. And I think that you would say, yeah, people have the right to discuss another culture's actions, even in a negative light. And I don't see why in fiction you can't do that. I wouldn't draw the line there and say you cannot do it. But I think it's a matter of sensibility, especially if you are descended from the colonial power that at one time enslaved a continent. And then you are, furthermore, saying, well, these are all the problems of these people. Then it feels like you're punching down and that perhaps you haven't fully considered the context of the situation, that you've only latched on to the fact that you can do it. You haven't thought about all the ramifications of doing this and how it might be harmful. So that's my response to this, which is that I don't think you cannot do it. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule, but I think you have to consider the context and consider the harm that it might do.
Well, there's also a difference between raising a question about the problems that a group of people face versus raising the question and saying that you're part of that group.
That's not clear to me. What do you mean?
It would be a different story, but you could have a white character who can see things. It wouldn't be from the inside, which is the problem. So it would be a different story. But you could have different viewpoints that weren't solely from this other group, in this case, the Kikuyu Society.
So you mean like more than the white characters that are already present in the book? Like if you had a main character who's white, not just like ex Julie or whatever from maintenance or that doctor or whoever.
It's a problem of voice, is what I'm trying to get to. He's speaking for other people.
I think where I agree with both of you is it's a matter of, perhaps you can say it's entitlement. When people feel for some reason that they are entitled to express an idea or an opinion, regardless of how other people might feel about it. The concern about negative representation is not central. I think this is what Sam was getting at, is that it's a problem, but the bigger problem is for somebody from the outside to feel that he can say anything. It's not the central concern to me because it's usually based on a personal concern. You don't want people saying negative things about your group. It matters to you specifically because it's your group. I think that this is one reason why the people who don't care about representation or they don't think that it's important, they dismiss it because they feel that representation is somehow at odds with the truth and that we have to sometimes hide the things that we think are true that we want to say because it would make other people feel bad. And that to me, I think, is perhaps where Resnick is coming from. When I was looking at this book, I found an article that he wrote in response to some critics. The article he wrote was, "Guys, my name isn't Kariba," where he's responding to people who associate Kariba's views with his own views. One reader wrote to him and said, "Oh, I don't like genital mutilation. I think it's disgusting." And his response to that was, well, the truth of the matter is, I didn't argue that it should exist anywhere in the world. I'm guilty of pointing out only that it does exist in Kikuyu society. So, this, I think, is an example of that kind of entitlement. He's saying, this exists, it's a real thing, therefore, my saying it is valid and I should be allowed to say it. And it's a kind of insistence on the truth, which makes people feel very bold when I'm saying that perhaps they shouldn't.
Well, and the way he does it, the way he goes about it, is a very exoticist way of doing so. He does it for shock value.
See, this is where I disagree. I don't think he really does. I think he presents it as blandly as possible. There's no people wailing over, oh no, you can't mutilate her. There's no big discussion on how right or wrong it is. He just says that's what they do, and that's it.
Well, he does, but at the beginning of the book, it felt very stark to me. By the end, I started to back away because I felt like maybe this was a real distinction that Kikuyu society places where there is a before circumcision and there's an after circumcision. And that is how you define childhood versus adulthood. So, in that sense, it felt maybe more normal. But before I had that understanding, and I don't even know if that understanding is correct, before I arrived at that understanding, it did feel like he had presented it, even if it was bland, he kept pointing to it. He kept bringing it up. Not graphically, just kept bringing it up.
So I do want to comment a bit on the truthfulness and how that pertains to representation, because I actually think that's really important. Like, representation isn't just factual. Yet I'm responding to the quote where he says, well, that's something that happens. When you're writing a character or a story, you have to be more than just factual. And one problem when you're writing across cultures, especially writing about a group of people from their point of view that are very different from your own, is that you probably don't understand what it's like to be them. You can imagine you do because you've met them or you've read about them, but at some core understanding, you don't have it because you are not them. There's just something missing here, something essential, you might say, that's missing. And I think that that is the problem. No matter how much research he does about being a Kikuyu, he is not a Kikuyu. And so if you're trying to represent something truthfully, if you're representing someone's existence truthfully, it is not just factual. You can't just say this is something that happens. It's more than that. And you see that in the kind of the blandness of the text where the characters are so, two-dimensional, because he is unable to really depict these characters as three-dimensional. He's not them. He doesn't actually know what they're like.
Yes, I think that's the larger question that I want to kind of pull back to explore with this idea of representation, because it seems like you and I agree, James. Perhaps this is more a question for Sam. Do you think that the content of a novel, whatever it is, regardless of how true or fair it might seem, coming from a Western author about the post-colonial other, can absolve the author of the reader's skepticism about the author's ability to represent those people.
I'm completely with James here. The truthfulness doesn't just come from facts.
I think then that we all kind of agree that being truthful is not enough. But is there anything about the content of a novel that matters, that perhaps you could say earns the novelist the ability to speak, or earns the novelist the ability to have his work respected? Kind of the converse of this, is there anything about being Western in itself that precludes representation of the other?
I'm going to draw a line here, sort of a tightrope to walk, because even though I've said that there's something that the writer cannot portray because the writer cannot fully understand a culture that's very different from their own, I will still say that it is possible to write a great work of literature featuring a character that is not from their own culture. Like, I think it's possible because you can still read that work with these caveats in mind, and you might still read it fully invested in the work. So, in a way, yes, like, I think you can still do it. I don't know if you would be absolved of all your sins of doing it, but I think it is possible to do it.
It's definitely possible. The writer is either going to do it or they aren't. They just have to be prepared to accept those consequences. No one is going to stop you from doing so, but you can't take the Resnick approach of having it both ways and just saying, I just said it exists. That's not good enough. You have to be ready to accept the backlash that is almost inevitably going to come.
For me, I think that we generally agree, but I want to say that there are two things that perhaps don't make it impossible to write about the other, but that problematize writing about the other to the extent that I don't think Western writers should do it. There are two things that I think are distinct from the content of the novel that make this authorial voice fundamentally unable to put itself on equal footing with a postcolonial subject. The first thing is something that we've talked about before. It's the Western or white gaze. And I think what that gaze does is it establishes itself as a default, in that the white gaze or the Western gaze looks at all of the quote unquote third world, yet the third world doesn't, or very rarely, looks at each other. We don't have different members of the third world looking or speaking to each other as often as we have the Western world looking in judgment upon the other. That to me is problematic. The effect of this is noted by historian Dipesh Chakraborty, who writes that Europe remains the sovereign theoretical subject of all histories, including the ones we call Indian, Chinese, Kenyan, and so on. There is a peculiar way in which all these other histories tend to become variations on a master narrative that could be called the history of Europe. The idea relevant to the discussion of this novel is that we have a gaze of the Western world looking at the quote unquote third world, where it doesn't add understanding. And obviously, you have to look from somewhere. There is no native place for us to look because these books are likely written in languages that we don't know. But because the Western gaze comes with this power built into it, it's very difficult for us, I think, to get something that would be more accurate, not in the sense of truthfulness, but accurate in the sense that it understands these people on their own terms. The second, and I think more serious concern, is how Western authorship, usually unwittingly, establishes Western values as a yardstick against which the third world subject is measured. And this is true even when the West is not explicitly part of the discussion. In the same article, Chakrabarty writes, only Europe, the argument would appear to be, is theoretically, that is, at the level of fundamental categories that shape historical thinking, knowable. All other histories are matters of empirical research that fleshes out a theoretical skeleton, which is substantially Europe. So, to unpack that, I think what he's trying to say here is that Western writers, and by extension, people influenced by Western thought, understand Western culture as a default. And we understand other cultures not in terms of how they exist in themselves, but in how they relate to Western cultures. We see this in the novel in Kirinyaga in how the stories fail to emphasize certain values that I think are actually important to the Kikuyu people. For example, the stability of their social roles, community membership, sense of purpose, mentorship, or continuity. All of these things I think are important values to other groups of people, but at least to my opinion, unvalued by Western audiences and by Western values. And that to me, I think, creates a sense that there is something lacking, where I think a non Western writer would not show that absence. I think also the stories amplify other values that I think a Western writer adds to the situation. For example, the story of Mumbi, the woman who moves to the hill, amplifies the value of individualism. Intellectualism is amplified by Ndemi, his protege, or Kamari, the little girl who wants to learn how to read. And also the character Wanda amplifies the value of progress. These are things, arguably, that the Kikuyu lack, but they are perhaps not important to the Kikuyu, so seeing this as an absence or a lack is a projection upon the third world that is not, perhaps to my mind, appropriate. So if you agree, then does that mean that this is a non-starter? Does this mean that it's not worth writing about other races or other groups if you are a Westerner?
I wouldn't say that it's not worth writing about, but I don't know that it's worth writing about from this point of view, which is to say, a point of view that has an opinion about it. I don't want to say you should just present it because that's kind of what he's doing, but he's presenting it with an opinion. By amplifying these things, as you pointed out, he's not presenting it blandly the way we discussed before. He does have a gaze, as you put it.
Yeah, but why is that a non starter? Like, everyone has a gaze, everyone has a bias.
Right.
If I write a female character, I have a bias because I'm not female, but it doesn't mean I can't write a female character.
For me, I would say the reason is because power exists. There is no reciprocity. The Western gaze is different from the third world gaze. When we look at them, we have the opportunity to say they are lacking in this way because they don't subscribe to our worldview. It doesn't work the other way around, does it?
Right. No, I agree. But why shouldn't a writer write it as long as a writer is conscious of the fact that they cannot escape this gaze? Why not write it? The problem here is that he's not very conscious of it. If you have a writer who understands that they are writing across cultures, that they are doing something difficult with all the problems that come with it, why not do it?
Well, the other problem, too, though, especially when this was written, is that there weren't other points of view. It was much easier to be a Mike Resnick than it was to be a Charles Saunders. So we had the white gaze, we didn't have any other gaze.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you can't have it. It just means that it would be better to have a more diverse point of view, but it doesn't mean you rule out one point of view entirely.
It doesn't, but we're coming at this from 20 years down the line when it's a lot easier to say, yeah, we should have and now do have other voices who can give other opinions. But it's a lot harder when there's only Mike Resnick's.
I'm going to say some very academic liberal PC soundbite that I think will probably perhaps come to haunt me in a job interview in the future someday. But what I want to
Well, you
say,
don't have to worry about getting a
yeah,
job yet. That's not going to happen.
the presence of the white gaze perverts the discourse. The presence of the white authorial voice prevents the expression of other non white voices from being heard and being expressed in the same way, because when power exists, it changes the other who experiences it. That kind of leads me into a broader question about cultural production. We could imagine a world, perhaps a better world, where we don't have to deal with just kind of Western and third world interacting back and forth, but rather you could think of it as a lattice where Westerners can communicate with people from other countries, but people from other countries can also communicate with themselves. And that would remove that type of power from the equation, which I think would remove this normalizing or perverting effect that I'm talking about. Because when you have, for example, a Bengali writer writing for a Mongolian reader, you don't have this imbalance of power where one is forced to adopt the other's values as a yardstick. That to me seems more equitable. It seems fair in a very broader sense than I think what Resnick imagines as fair. But even though I think that might be a preferable situation, I'm just wondering if it's even possible, because it seems, just according to the rules of global capitalism and the market, it would be so inefficient that it would never happen.
Well, if you broaden it from just written work, you certainly have people from Thailand watching Bollywood, and you have people from India listening to K-pop. If you take text out of it, because that is actually a very limiting factor, because text is hard to translate, it's not as popular, you have to devote quite a bit of time, and you just look at culture at large, then yeah, you do have more of a lattice. But of course, English is the hub still.
But also, you're still talking about a native writer or creator showing their wares to outsiders rather than outsiders creating about a native population.
But that's what he's talking about. He's talking about disseminating across cultures that doesn't have to go through American or European culture, right? Like if
Right.
you just directly sell your own cultural wares to another non-white culture.
Right.
I'm saying it is possible, but it's not common. It's not as common. I mean, Bollywood is huge.
I think the trend is in general away from that. And I think where it happens because certain Western values have been adopted, or at least I would say the fringe cases, the peculiarities of each quote unquote third world culture have been eliminated. So the singing and dancing that we find in Bollywood are transmitted very easily, but the idea of arranged marriages that we find in many Indian cultures would not be transmitted in the same way. So it's this kind of dulling effect where you remove all of the peculiarities that would mark one culture as distinct from another. And you just are left with this kind of bland middle, which is fine because it has to be sold. It is a marketplace, but you don't have the ability for things to be judged in the same way that they would if Western culture had never been established as the kind of yardstick against which others are measured.
I don't agree. I think that, this blandness comes from two cultures meeting in the middle. Like, if you did not have Western culture being the arbiter of taste, you would still need to be able to sell your film to another country and not have it offend that country, if it's at all possible to live in this hypothetical timeline. I don't think this kind of blandness comes from the influence of the West. I think it comes from what happens when, Japanese anime gets sold to India or Russia or wherever. In this kind of need to sell, you have to find something that's palatable, irrespective of Western tastes.
That's true. The reason why I'm centered on the West is just because the West has power. So I wouldn't even say it's the West because I would include Japan as having that same sort of economic power, or South Korea as well. It's really a different sort of disadvantage. But besides that, I think what I'm getting at is that if we were starting from scratch, it would operate the same way that you're talking about. But because we're not starting from scratch, we already are operating in a world where Western culture has set the scene and set the rules of the game. That is not necessarily a bad thing because over time, I do think that Western values of global capitalism are going to gradually transform into what we could consider global values, which will kind of obviate the whole discussion because everyone will just kind of agree. Do you think that that situation in any time scale is likely?
See, that's where I feel like I don't know if I can see that happening with a quote unquote global set of values. Because I think that still might center back to European thinking. A good example of that is female circumcision, I think, is considered almost universally cruel. But I know that that is European thinking, that's Western thinking. So, me saying that it's almost universal, that might be true, but it's still leaving out the actual culture that it comes from.
Yes, but I do think even that is not so important because the people in that culture who care about it tend to be older and they will die. Younger people very often care less about traditional culture than their parents and older ancestors do.
Right.
So, on the very long time scale, I think there is a general trend towards homogeneity because we are becoming a quote unquote global village. We increasingly wear the same clothes, we eat the same food, we do the same things. So, I think very gradually in time, we will become the same.
Yes, to a point, but it's hard for me to decisively say that there will be a distinct set of values that everyone can agree on, other than just the big polar things, the things that are easy for everyone to agree on. For example, I could see female circumcision being one of the things that eventually everyone can agree on.
Let's all do it.
Yeah, let's all do it.
All right. Now that we've plotted out the future, let's stop here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base, if you love female circumcision, come and let us know on Reddit. That link is below. You can find us on social media at Canonical Pod. You can let us know that way as well. If you'd like to support us at your local bookstore, you can find our bookshop.org link in our episode description. And if you'd like to support us by leaving a nice review, you can do that on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with a review of The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.